Today, we turn our attention away from steel mills, stock tickers, and trust busting, or the lack thereof, and instead look outward, across the oceans, to examine American foreign policy during the Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s through the turn of the 20th century. This was the moment when the United States, having filled its continental borders, often brutally, always decisively, looked at the rest of the world and said, well, what's next? And the answer, as it turned out, was Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, China, and a seat at the table of global power, a table previously dominated by Europeans who had been practicing imperialism far longer than we had. Now, let me be clear at the outset. I am not one of those historians who pretends American expansion was merely a series of unfortunate accidents caused by bad headlines and overenthusiastic naval officers, nor am I one who thinks empire is just a dirty word invented by graduate students. American expansion strengthened the nation, secured markets, protected trade routes, and announced, rather loudly, that the United States was no longer a provincial republic hiding behind the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And yet, and this is the rub, it came at a significant cost to our Republican values, our constitutional restraint, and our long-standing suspicion of foreign entanglements. In short, the Gilded Age is when the United States began the long, uncomfortable transformation from republic to global power, and it did so with enthusiasm, anxiety, and more than a little chest thumping. For most of the 19th century, American foreign policy was guided by a simple principle articulated by George Washington: avoid permanent alliances and foreign wars. That advice worked rather well when the nation was weak, but by the 1890s, the United States was no longer weak. We were the world's leading industrial producer, bursting with surplus goods, hungry for new markets, and increasingly aware that Europe had already carved up most of the globe. The British had India, the French had Indochina, the Germans were late but aggressive, and even Belgium, for heaven's sake, had its claws in the Congo. America, meanwhile, had a navy that ranked behind Portugal. That was not going to do. As Senator Henry Cabot Lodge bluntly put it, commerce follows the flag, but the flag does not follow commerce. In other words, if you wanted trade, you needed power, naval power, territorial power, and political power. This mindset marked a profound shift. America was no longer asking how to avoid global competition. It was asking how to win it. Let us begin with Hawaii, because nothing says defensive foreign policy quite like overthrowing a sovereign monarchy. By the late 19th century, Hawaii was economically dominated by American sugar planters, many of whom had lived there for decades and treated the islands less like a foreign nation and more like a corporate subsidiary. Sugar mattered. Sugar meant money, and money meant politics. When Queen Liliuokalani attempted to assert Hawaiian sovereignty and limit foreign influence, American businessmen responded in the traditional Republican fashion. They staged a coup, with the assistance of U.S. Marines, who were, we are told, merely protecting American lives and property. The monarchy was overthrown in 1893. President Grover Cleveland, to his credit, was horrified. He called the overthrow an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States. Cleveland tried to reverse it. Congress ignored him. And in 1898, under President William McKinley, Hawaii was formally annexed. Now, strategically speaking, this was a masterstroke. Hawaii became the keystone of American power in the Pacific, a naval coaling station, and later the home of Pearl Harbor. Economically, it tied America more tightly to Pacific trade. But politically, it marked a turning point. For the first time, the United States acquired territory without any intention of eventual statehood or self-rule. This was not manifest destiny. This was imperial logic. If Hawaii was the key to the Pacific, China was the prize. By the late 19th century, Americans were convinced of two things. One, China was an enormous untapped market. Two, Europeans were about to shut us out of it. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan were carving China into spheres of influence, controlling ports, railroads, and trade routes. The United States, lacking colonies but not confidence, proposed the open door policy in 1899. Secretary of State John Hay declared that China should remain territorially intact. All nations should have equal trading rights. This was, on its face, an anti-imperialist policy. In practice, it was a demand that the United States enjoy imperial benefits without imperial responsibilities. It was a very American solution. The open door policy signaled that the United States intended to compete globally, not by conquering China, but by insisting on access backed by naval power. And yes, when the Boxer Rebellion erupted in 1900, American troops joined European forces to suppress it. Republics, it turns out, also send gunboats. Now we come to the centerpiece of Gilded Age foreign policy, the Spanish-American War of 1898. This war lasted about 4 months, produced a remarkable amount of poetry, and permanently altered America's role in the world. The causes were many: sympathy for Cuban rebels, economic interests in sugar, strategic concerns in the Caribbean, and of course, newspapers screaming for blood, which brings us to William Randolph Hearst. Hearst understood something fundamental about democracy. If you control the headlines, you can control public outrage. When a reporter told Hearst there was no war to cover in Cuba, Hearst allegedly replied, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Now, historians debate whether he actually said this, but the sentiment is undeniably accurate. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 sailors, Hearst's papers immediately blamed Spain. The actual cause remains unclear, but clarity is not required when you have nationalism. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry, and Congress declared war. The result was what Secretary of State John Hay famously called a splendid little war. Spain was defeated with embarrassing speed, and the United States emerged with Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and effective control over Cuba. That is a remarkable list for a nation supposedly allergic to empire. No discussion of this era is complete without Theodore Roosevelt, a man who believed deeply in virtue, strength, and the value of getting punched in the face occasionally. Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to form the Rough Riders, proving that he was not merely an imperial theorist, but an imperial participant. He believed that national greatness required military readiness, expansion. And what he called the strenuous life, Roosevelt rejected the idea that America could remain virtuous by remaining small. He argued instead that power properly exercised was a moral good. And yet even Roosevelt recognized the dangers. He worried that empire might soften the republic, corrupt its politics, and entangle it in endless foreign disputes. He once warned, "A republic cannot long endure unless it possesses both strength and self-restraint." That tension defines the Gilded Age perfectly. The most troubling legacy of the Spanish-American War was the Philippines. Unlike Cuba, the Philippines did not receive independence. Instead, the United States fought a brutal 3-year war against Filipino nationalists, men who had believed American promises of liberation. The war involved guerrilla fighting, civilian casualties, torture, and racial rhetoric that would make Jefferson uncomfortable. This was no longer liberation. This was occupation. Mark Twain, once a patriot, became a fierce critic, writing, "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." And here is where historians must be honest. The Philippines were strategically valuable. They expanded American influence in Asia. They secured trade routes. But they represented a direct contradiction of Republican ideals. A nation founded on consent of the governed was now ruling millions who had never consented. That contradiction has never fully gone away. So how should we judge American foreign policy during the Gilded Age? It made the United States a global economic power, a naval force to be reckoned with, a serious competitor to Europe. It secured markets, trade routes, and national prestige, but it also expanded executive power, normalized foreign intervention, and weakened the old suspicion of empire. The United States emerged stronger, but also less innocent, and perhaps that is inevitable. As historian Walter McDougall once observed, a nation that becomes great must learn to live with the moral consequences of its greatness. The Gilded Age taught America how to wield power. The 20th century would test whether it could wield it wisely. Thank you.